So I just finished Babel by R.F. Kuang after too long that I care to mention. But I've got lots of little thoughts and lots of ideas, and I've been thinking a lot about fantasy in general. I think I'm going to save the Babel chat for a different video, but because I've been thinking a lot about fantasy, I thought I would do a top 10 fantasy books. They are ranked, kind of vaguely, quite vaguely ranked, but leading up to my number one favorite and starting at number 10, which is The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This book was first published in 1872, and it's only the second oldest book on this list. So yes, I am a backlist boy. The story opens with the narrator explaining the goblins to us, and it's pretty interesting because these goblins used to be a group of ordinary people who were treated severely by their kingdom, and so the end result is they get driven underground, and the narrator is really wishy-washy about what actually happened. He's like, maybe it was taxes, I don't know. That part is just fascinating because it's like, why does an oppressed minority have to just up and leave their home? Anyway, the goblins rightfully harbor a grudge against the Sun People, which is what we need to know here, and they especially harbor that grudge against the descendants of the royal family that drove them underground in the first place, including our protagonist, the young eponymous princess Irene, who lives in this very fancy house which is apart from the castle, and she's not allowed to go out at night because that is when the goblins can come up from the ground and go and do mischievous things. So she's basically stuck in this house, and she goes exploring, and one day she finds some mysterious rooms and some kind of spooky goings on in those rooms, and that is how the story begins. I read this book 1 or 2 years ago, and at the time one of the things that stood out to me the most was the hereditary stuff, both with the goblins, but like the thing that they talk about more in it is the animals. They kind of get these animals and they domesticate them, but they do that by bringing them underground. And in the story, those animals sort of like, from being forced to live underground, end up twisting and like eventually what we would say evolved into a different kind of species, and they're all freaky and quite scary. Yeah, like I'm looking at my notes now, and the first thing I have written is that this book came out 13 years after Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species was published. That's the first note that I took on reading this book. It just makes me think that like people must have low-key been really kind of pretty scared about this mainstreaming of the idea that animals, and especially humans, could just by time and circumstance twist into whole new forms. There's just a sort of grotesque level to that, which I think comes out surprisingly strongly in this book. But anyway, yeah, as an adult reading this, Darwinism was the thing which made me most excited about it. But if I'd read this as a kid, I'm sure other things would have really enchanted me, especially like some of the scarier scenes in the tunnels where Irene, and then there's another main character, a boy called Curdy, who's a miner's son, and they just go through dark, scary caverns where, you know, there could be potentially goblins. And the reason I think that would have made an impression on me is because there's another book on this list about children in a fantasy setting going through these dark subterranean passages, and that left a massive impression on me. So I think that Princess and the Goblin probably would have done the same. Okay, so what I've done is I've just swiveled around, done a 180 because I need light, and I always film these when the sun is setting and the light in the apartment is over there. So where are we? The Minpins. The Minpins by Roald Dahl at number 9. This is actually the last book that Roald Dahl ever wrote. There's a little boy called Billy, and he lives in a house by a forest. His mom tells him, don't go into the forest, there's lots of monsters. So Billy is very bored, and he's sitting in the house not knowing what to do with himself, and then Billy hears the voice of the devil. And the devil tells Billy that in the forest there are strawberries. So, with this new information, Billy goes to the forest, goes exploring, and is instantly attacked by a monster. This is a favorite from when I was very young, and there are 2 reasons why it sticks with me. One of them is the illustrations by a guy called Patrick Benson. He has these kind of almost like blurry, I guess impressionistic vistas, landscapes where Billy looks really small but the forest looks so big. The world of the forest just seems so murky but also so vast. They're quite like realistic in a way, even though they're impressionistic, but like, you know, they don't look cartoony like Quentin Blake's illustrations. Quentin Blake usually worked with Roald Dahl, and I think this book is also published with his illustrations in it, but don't get that. I mean, I haven't read it, maybe his illustrations are great, but I mean, if you want to kind of experience it the way that I did and the way that I will always remember this book, then it is definitely with these Patrick Benson beautiful illustrations. And they're like kind of it's a really big book, like big double page kind of spreads. And also the monster, you never see the monster. It's always behind this like kind of red cloud of smoke that is billowing out of its snout. So there's just like kind of like reddish dark patches on the page where you just see like little outlines of like its teeth, and not being able to see the monster is very Lovecraft. It's very cosmic horror. With those illustrations, it's probably the most Lovecraftian rolled out you can get. But that's not a selling point. I don't know what is. And the second thing I think that made this really stick with me is this business with the devil and the strawberries. This sort of like, now I see it as like a kind of, you know, fairy tale version of Genesis. But I guess like as a kid, I was also told something similar about, you know, don't listen to the voice of the devil in your head when you're tempted to do something bad, like eat sweets, you know, or something like that. And I always found it very mysterious and like didn't really understand what the consequences would be. I guess like in this book they show you what the consequences are. But I should say, as well as the consequences, it also shows a way back home, which I think is like essential, right? In the Forest of Sin, there are these little creatures called Minpins, which are just like little people. And Billy helps them out and they help him out. They also have this massive swan, which is very cool. So yeah, Forest of Sin, bit dangerous, but also full of adventure and life and friendship and this big massive swan. So on the whole, you know, a very good time. I do kind of wonder if this very short, simple fairy tale actually prefigures Philip Pullman's fantasy. And this is like kind of, I think, earlier in the 90s. So it's not like that long before it. And it's also kind of retelling Genesis. And it's also about, you know, you grow up, you leave your mum behind, and anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, the backdrop is kind of cool, actually. Maybe I'll do this in the future. Number 8 is the Odyssey by Homer. Odysseus is a reluctant captain who had to fight for 10 years in a war that he didn't want to go to, and now he is finally going home. But to get home, he has to go on a very long sea voyage. And on the way, there's all sorts of obstacles, including sea monsters, cannibals, a cyclops, bad weather, magical fruit, stupid companions, and beautiful goddesses who want to sleep with him forever on their beautiful paradise islands. That happens twice. Poor Odysseus. Just the other day, I clicked on a Brandon Sanderson YouTube short. He's another big fantasy writer. You've probably heard of him. I've not read anything by him yet. And one of the comments was something along the lines of, stop wasting your time on trivial escapism. Read real literature. Start with the Greeks. And actually, like, it had a few likes, which I thought was just kind of funny. Like, why would you go to that particular video to make that particular comment? But in any context, like, that is just a objectively funny thing to say. Like, which Greeks is this guy talking about? Because if he's talking about Homer, you know, and look, when it comes to Homer, I am Team Iliad, right? Like, for me, that is just objectively better than the Odyssey. And the Iliad does have a lot of, you know, magic and gods and, I don't know, background, political, world building, if you want to like use the sort of fantasy terms or whatever. But the Odyssey just fits as fantasy more, like when we think about what the fantasy genre is, like having a vast world full of magical creatures and a series of adventures that a hero and his companions have to go on that make up a longer journey through that world, and a bunch of dangerous monsters which need to be overcome in order for the hero to accomplish his mission. So that's why the Odyssey is taking up my Greek myth slot on this list. I'm not going to do the Greek tragedies or anything like that, because while they also, you know, take place in the same world and they draw on the same myths, they're just like very, very different from what we think of when we think of the fantasy genre. And for those of you who may be thinking about reading the Odyssey before the major motion picture Christopher Nolan Big Bonanza Extravaganza movie comes out next year, starring Matt Damon, oh my god. If you're thinking about maybe reading it before the movie comes out, but you're not quite sure maybe because you're not an ancient classics kind of person, then you should know that it does have amazing themes about hospitality and storytelling woven throughout. It's got this great structure which makes it feel almost like a modern novel. We start in the middle, and we don't start with Odysseus, we start with his son and wife, but eventually we do get to Odysseus, and then he needs to tell his story, so he goes back to the beginning and starts telling it, and that in itself is fascinating because that part is obviously in the first person, and so it's unreliable, right? Because Odysseus is most famous as being a liar. And then eventually he finishes telling the story, so we go from the middle to the beginning, and then we finally get the end, and then when the end finishes we get a second ending added on, because why not? Number 7, Watership Down by Richard Adams, in which a group of rabbits escape the destruction of their warren by humans and then go off on a long quest across the world to find a new homeland. I realize now that even though I just said I'm done with the Greek myth stuff, this one is actually quite Greek myth, because I mean, like, clearly it draws a lot in Greek mythology. So it begins with this rabbit called Fiver having a prophecy about the it's actually like Final Destination. He has like a vision of the Warren being destroyed and like blood flowing through the tunnels, and it's all apocalyptic and scary. And then he kind of wakes up from it and tells his brother, "We gotta get out of here." Oh my god, it's just the same as Final Destination. I just realized that now. That's crazy. I don't know how I feel about that. So yeah, Fiver is like Cassandra, who tells everybody that she has foreseen that Troy is going to fall in a horrible genocidal bloodbath, but nobody believes her. But in this case, Fiver is believed by his older brother Hazel, who does manage to then become kind of like Aeneas from the Aeneid and gather a group of like basically refugees to escape the Warren and go to make a new homeland. So just like Aeneas has to bring his people to another part of the world so that they can found Rome, so does Hazel have to lead his people to another part of the world so they can found Watership Down. Watership Down is Rome. You heard it here first. But yeah, obviously Moses and like there's other stuff that's like this as well. I'm still kind of shook about the Final Destination thing. I can't believe I never thought about that. In my head now, I've got this through line, right? From like, 2,000-year-old Greek mythology through 1970s talking rabbits down to 2000 really cheesy horror movies. Anyway, what makes this book stand out is the fact that the rabbits actually have their own mythology, their own customs, their own traditions, their own religion, their own language. They even have their own death rabbit. That's what makes this feel like epic fantasy, even though it's just bunnies. And there's no magic, and the rabbits don't have like little swords or little bows and arrows or anything like that, but it does feel like epic fantasy because of this like really immersive world building. And like I think that a lot of fantasy is derivative of Tolkien's work, whereas this one really follows his method because it draws on a lot of mythology to create a new kind of imaginative world. And also like Tolkien, I think there's this focus on the natural world and just like a group of lovable characters making their way through and across these different landscapes to achieve their quest. And also like another interesting thing I found out recently was that it's based on war experiences, or like kind of derived from personal war experiences from the writer. So a lot of parallels there, kind of spooky. Speaking of spooky, we are now on to the spookiest of the Narnia books, which is The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. When I was a kid, my favorite Narnia was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's just got so much adventure, these great characters. They go from island to island. There's physical metamorphosis and some weird stuff with dreams. And they end up going to the end of the world. But as I've gotten older, basically, the presence of all of the Narnia books have dimmed in my memory and sort of just like faded in a way that lots of books that, when they're your favorite when you're a kid, but as you grow up, you kind of, you move on to different things, except for The Silver Chair. Like I remember the plots and the characters more or less, I think, of the other novels in the series, but not the power, not the sort of the emotions. The only one where that has stayed with me is The Silver Chair. Maybe it's because the plot doesn't really matter so much in this one, or at least it's not the most notable thing about it. There's two kids from our world. They find a door into a magical world called Narnia, where a giant talking lion called Aslan gives them a mission to go and rescue a prince from a witch. Okay, yeah, sure, very Narnia. What sets The Silver Chair apart is the tone and the mood, right? It's grimmer, it's darker, it's wetter. They have to go through a swamp where they meet this companion who's called Puddleglum, and Puddleglum is a marsh wiggle, which is basically the Narnia magical creature version of a depressed adult man. And this trio is great, I should say. Like we have Jill, who is really strong-willed, Eustace, who's returning from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I think he's my favorite character from that. He's just like this asshole who learns to be good through suffering, basically. And then we have Puddleglum, who, as I've said, is just a depressed adult man, but with a wide-brimmed hat and webbed feet. There's this amazing scene where they're guests in a castle and they're served meat, and then after they've eaten the meat, they learn that it came from a talking animal. And there's this spectrum of reactions, right? Where Jill, who's never been to Narnia before, doesn't really get what the big deal is. Whereas Eustace, who's been in Narnia before, knows that there is a clear distinction between an animal that talks and doesn't, and it's something like the soul maybe. So he feels like really like very unhappy about the fact that he's just done this. And then there's Puddleglum, who is a native resident of Narnia who is just like, I don't know, he's probably throwing up or something, or he's just like traumatized for the rest of his life because he's basically a cannibal now. And yeah, this is the one where they go underground that I mentioned before, right? Like at some point they go underground. In my mind, in my heart, it's like the whole second half of the book takes place under the ground, but that's probably my memory playing tricks on me. I just remember being with these people deep underground for a long time and getting a very specific vibe from that, which I still feel to this day. Number 5 is the second book on this list about little people, and if you know this channel, you probably know what I'm talking about already. It's Truckers by Terry Pratchett. It's about a group of gnomes who have lived for generations in a department store which is about to be torn down. And then an outside group of gnomes comes in and tries to convince them to leave so that they don't, all die. It's actually quite similar to the beginning of Watership Down in that way, beginning with the sort of the homeland becoming the site of apocalypse, right? And the need for an exodus into the unknown. But the difference is, while that is like the first chapter of Watership Down, this is the whole book. This is basically a really funny and exciting retelling of Plato's parable of the cave, where you have a bunch of people who see shadows on the wall, and one of them goes outside and realizes that the shadows are cast by objects outside the cave, so he goes back in and tells them, look, you're only looking at shadows, there's actually a whole world out there. And then the people in the cave don't believe him, right? Because they're like, nah, this is probably the real world. You're just some crazy guy, right? This is basically that. Only the difference is, first of all, there's a capitalist kind of consumerist critique going on, which is very funny and modern, because the shadow world is the world of the department store, right? Like it's plastic trees and all these items which are just existing to be sold and bought, right? And then the other thing that's different is that, if it's to go back to the Plato thing, it's as though the cave is about to like collapse on their heads, right? And so the guy who's come back not only needs to convince them about, the nature of reality itself, but also needs to get them out of the cave as soon as possible so they don't get squished. When I read this book as a kid, the philosophical stuff completely blew my mind. And then when I read it again more recently as an adult, it completely blew my mind again, but for different reasons. This time it was the stuff about community and organizing and this whole problem of like, how do we make progress as a society? I did a whole review on this one, so if that sounds interesting and you want to hear more, then you can go check that out. Number 4 is one that I sort of teased earlier. It's The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman, the second book in His Dark Materials trilogy. Pronouns, man. I guess I'm only doing one book per series here. So of that trilogy, this is the one that I would pick. Kind of standing in for the whole though. The story follows Will, a schoolboy in the UK who is struggling to take care of his mom at home, who basically seems to have some sort of mental illness. And then one night, some men break into their house, and in a struggle involving a cat, Will accidentally pushes one of the men down the stairs and kills him. Will then runs away from home, finds a portal into another world, and finds himself in the sunny city of Cittàgazze, which is basically just Italy. I swear, for British people, Italy is just some sort of fantasy land or whatever. Like, I feel like I've seen this more than once. Anyway, in Cittàgazze, Will meets a girl called Lyra, whose soul is on the outside in the form of an animal, or a demon it's called, but it takes the form of a shape-shifting animal. And Will and Lyra and her demon Pantaleimon slowly have to start to learn to trust each other and navigate this world and the different windows between worlds as they move across like different parallel universes. Key to the whole thing is that both Will and Lyra are sort of running either away from or towards their mothers and fathers, who have a series of interconnected mysteries which need to be solved. I should say that while this book starts almost as though it's a standalone novel, the way that it really works is because it slowly introduces the characters and events of the first book. So even though it begins like its own thing with its own main character and so on and so forth, it really, like, you have to read it like having already read the first one. While Will and Lyra are technically children throughout the series, I do think that the second book is sort of like the puberty book. At least it feels that way to me, because it's like sandwiched between the childhood of book 1 and the adulthood of book 3. Book 1, Northern Lights, or The Golden Compass if you're from America, don't get me started. Book 1 is about Lyra, and it's a sort of fantasy adventure journey where it's got relatively low stakes. She is trying to save her friend and a bunch of kidnapped children, and so they have to travel to the snowy north, and there's talking polar bears. On the other hand, the third book, The Amber Spyglass, Glass is basically a sci-fi epic set across dozens of worlds with like hundreds of characters, and it's restaging Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is, you know, the Christian rebellion of Satan against God. The Subtle Knife is basically the bridge between these two genres and these two like scales of stakes, right? Like from low to incredibly high. It still feels intimate and character driven, but at the same time, the worlds are slowly beginning to literally open up at Will's fingertips once he gets the magical object of the Subtle Knife. There is world hopping in the Subtle Knife, but unlike in the third one, there are severe limitations to it, which makes it much more engaging, I think, because like, for example, Will is wanted by the police in our world, right, for questioning, so he doesn't really want to come back here. Also in Chitagate, there's these creatures called specters, which basically like eat your soul if you're an adult. So that's a safe zone for Will and Lyra from people who might hurt them, but they're also on the cusp of puberty, so that creates this great tension where we're worried about them growing up, because if they go past at the point of no return through adolescence and they're in Chitagate, then suddenly, you know, they could have their souls eaten. Also, I think like second parts in a trilogy get the benefit of being allowed to have a really drastically tragic ending, because that can set you up for the big finale, right? Like just completely ending on a emotional intensity that normally you wouldn't be able to do in a fantasy book. So like that's the case here. Books with amazing endings basically leave me forever biased in favor of that book, and The Subtle Knife is no exception. Moving into the top three with Comet in Moominland by Tove Jansson. Of the Moomin books that I've read so far, as well as being my favorite, this is the one which is most like a traditional fantasy adventure, because you have a group of different creatures from different species who are going on a quest together, basically to try to save the world. It's a sort of there and back again quest, walking across natural landscapes, and there's a bunch of monsters and magical creatures along the way. The story is that one day, Moomin Troll and his adopted brother Sniff notice these omens, like different things, like little animals making strange symbols and so on. And all of these omens seem to have something to do with a comet in the sky. They ask the muskrat, who is a philosopher, what they should do, and he advises them to go to the Lonely Mountains, also a bit Tolkien-esque there, right? To a place called the Observatory, because in the observatory there are scientists who work there, and they can ask them, will the comet hit Moomin Valley or will it pass them by? More than anything, I think this book has fantastic characters, right? This is the one that introduces Snufkin, the musical hobo fan favorite, who's like really well known for being chill and just like fishing and playing his harmonica. But also at one point in this book, he goes off on a rant about how much he hates the police. And it also introduces my own favorite character of the series, the shamelessly vain Snork Maiden, who's basically decided that she is the protagonist of a romance novel and her love interest is Moomin Troll. Despite the fact that this is a translation from the original Swedish, I would say this is probably the most beautifully written book on this list, and it's definitely the most beautifully illustrated. Like at one point the party finds this sea which has been dried up by the heat of the approaching comet, and so they decide to cross it on stilts, I guess to avoid like going through the sludge and kind of like leftover sea creatures on the bottom. And the picture that Jansson draws, it's really like Dali. It's like exactly the Dali kind of brand of surrealism, but in Tove Jansson's unique style, of course, and tied to her own narrative and her own characters. Now for number two, I know I did say that thing just now with his Dark Materials that I was just picking one book from a series, but this one's kind of different. It's the Lord of the Rings, right? And I know that a lot of people treat this as one book, which is apparently what Tolkien always intended, but was forced by the publisher to publish it as three different ones. But I mean, I think I've always treated it in my head as a trilogy, and I do feel that those three books have their own kind of like arcs and things going on in them and their own kind of flavor. And when I was a kid, definitely I liked the Two Towers the most. Now maybe it would be the Fellowship of the Ring, although I think I'm also very biased by the movies because I haven't read Lord of the Rings in a really long time, but I've seen the movies a lot. And of the movies, the Fellowship of the Ring absolutely is my favorite. But yeah, like I think maybe I'll just call it like one story for the sake of convenience in this list, even though it might be cheating. I don't know, whatever. It's the Lord of the Rings, you know, it's all great. One day, Frodo the Hobbit's crazy uncle literally disappears and leaves him his fancy house, which is actually a hole in the ground, but it's like a middle class hole in the ground, so it's basically a fancy house in a hill. And in that fancy house there is a magic ring which makes you invisible, which is great, but could also bring about the destruction of the world, which is not so great. So it turns out that Frodo's uncle left him not just a fancy hole in the ground, but also the crushing weight of an impossible responsibility. And he wears it on a little chain around his neck, like is the albatross from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Honestly, Frodo is just so great, and like my childhood idol probably, and I don't know, the movies did him dirty. I feel like there's not much more for me to say. I mean, there's millions of things to say about Lord of the Rings, but you know, there's too much. And I think like there's loads of stuff of that already. Lots of people know about it, and yeah, I'll just move on to number one, which is of course the Japanese manga Dungeon Meshi, which is kind of cheating. I feel like this is the most cheating kind of one because I haven't finished the series is one thing. This is a story about a group of adventurers who one of their party gets eaten by a dragon in the dungeon, and so they have to go and rescue her from the belly of the beast, but at the same time they have to fill their own bellies because they are poor, and so they have to find ways to cook the various monsters that attack them in the dungeon. Now at this point, I know some people who watch this channel will be wondering if I just set up this whole video as a vehicle to smuggle in more chat about this manga series that I'm obsessed with. And I'm neither gonna confirm nor deny that, but since it's next to Lord of the Rings, I think I do want to talk about this in the context of Lord of the Rings, because I think that's actually quite a fruitful avenue for explaining like why I like this so much. So when I was a kid, yeah, it's obviously story time now, right? Yeah. When I was a kid, Tolkien was like a visionary to me, right? Like his work opened up this whole new world that I was overwhelmed by, and I wanted to live there, and everything was so new and fresh. Now I'm in my 30s, right? And like when I think about Tolkien and Tolkien-like stuff, then I still get a lot of pleasure from that, but it's a totally different kind of pleasure. It's familiar. It's like elves, orcs, hobbits, great. And on the one hand, at this point in my life, I do quite like and value that sense of comfort. But on the other hand, I've never really been the kind of person who likes being too comfortable, do you know what I mean? I'm no Bilbo Baggins, which I think is why I've also never been drawn to what they call high fantasy, which to me just seems like, you know, basically imitation Tolkien. Like, why read this when I have the real Tolkien back at home, you know what I mean? Because of that bias, I've probably missed a lot of good fantasy actually, and that's probably why there's not so much modern fantasy on this list, although that is something that I'm slowly starting to rectify these days. Dungeon Meshi begins with the Tolkien setup, where you have this multi-ethnic group which have these races that, you know, Tolkien, while he drew from mythology, he basically refined into his own imaginative version of elves and dwarves and hobbits and so on. And each member of the party is like a representative who brings their own skills, and they go on a quest. And that formula got taken into the Dungeons and Dragons board game, right, in like the 70s and 80s. Then in the 90s, that formula came into Japanese video games, and then I think in like the 2000s or 2010s, that video game format came into the world of like manga and anime. And that's basically how we end up with this setup, which is crucially like presenting itself as just silly, comfortable, cozy fun at the beginning, right? Like this is just about cooking monsters. It's not so serious. They're joking about whether they're gonna eat the dragon that ate the main character's sister, and if that would be like kind of a weird sort of cannibalism. And you know, there's just a lot of silliness in it, and you can just kind of relax and recognize the tropes. Like everything about the setup of this is telling you do not need to be too involved with this story. You can just switch off your brain and enjoy the ride and have a few laughs with these characters who are trying to cook in a fantasy world. But here is the crucial thing, to use, I hope for the last time, another example from Greek myth. That cozy Tolkien-esque setup is a Trojan horse set up by the genius mangaka Ryoko Kui to smuggle in her talent, these expertly written characters, this involving world building, very thoughtful, quite clever themes about coexistence, and never really throwing it in your face, right? Like while the characters are fighting basilisks and then arguing about like how to cook their eggs and so on, and whether the egg is more like a chicken egg or a snake egg, you know, fun stuff like that, there's always so much restraint because you're always being shown just enough hints of characterization and world building to keep your interest, right? While all the time everything is being fleshed out piece by little piece. And now if I was to pick one volume, which is my favorite of the ones I've read so far, it will be volume 5, because that is where the dragon story, you know, Save the Sister from the Dragon, concludes. or it's kind of just after it's concluded, right? I won't say what happens, right? But it concludes and the characters don't know what to do or where to go or how to proceed, and they're lost basically. And we, the reader, also feel lost because we've had this progress, this mission, this sense of like structure. And maybe Ryoko Kui was kind of lost while she was writing it as well. I don't know, but whatever the reasoning, there are some big tonal shifts, and that restraint is basically gone. And I think that the changes would be a big turnoff for a lot of people who were just there for the comfort food, right? As for my personal experience though, it's like, imagine you had a friend who is a slapstick comedian and also a really good cook, right? And you just spend a lot of time hanging out with them and you enjoy how they're also quite thoughtful and clever about a lot of things. And then one day you hang out and they're just not smiling anymore. If the reason you're hanging out with this person was just for the comfy vibes and the silly jokes and the interesting recipes, then you'll probably be disappointed. But if by this point you've come to see them as a real friend, then you probably want to stick around and find out what's on their mind. I guess if the story was divided in the way that like novels in a fantasy series normally would be, then this point would be the end of book 1, which was Save the Girl from the Dragon, and the beginning of book 2, which is what do we do now, right? And it's also, like I said, like the point where all these backgrounded, kind of more mature themes come crashing into the foreground, which I would imagine doesn't go down well with some readers, but for me brings that freshness and maturity, which I really like. I suppose I value overall more than I value the coziness of Elves and Dragons. Anyway, that was my list, and I'm really looking forward to it changing actually as I discover more and more great fantasy books. Please let me know your favorites down in the comments, and like clearly I need to read more modern fantasies, so hit me up with those recommendations. If you liked the video, please leave a like, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!